Hello and welcome back to Tinker Talks Guns. Today we're going to talk about the Iver Johnson first model safety hammerless automatic in .32 Smith & Wesson. Iver Johnson is a company that started in 1871. They made firearms and bicycles. Don't ask me, I don't know. Anyway, this isn't Forgotten Weapons, so we're not going to delve too deep into that. But this model was made from 1895 to 1896, so this gun's over 120 years old, and it's kind of a dandy little revolver, and this is the sort of gun that average people bought for self-defense. And, it was viewed as sort of the minimum adequate at the time. .32 Smith & Wesson, it's not a very powerful cartridge. The original loading, it used an 85 grain bullet at about 705 feet per second from a typical 3¼ inch barrel for 90 some foot-pounds of energy. Not a barn burner by any means, but it was considered to be the minimum adequate, and people don't like being shot, so revolvers like this sold for relatively little money. I suppose the modern equivalent would be about $125 to $150, which the average person could stretch their budget to afford, and many, many of them did. Iver Johnson made a lot of revolvers, and this is one of them, and I rather like it. So let's go to the tabletop and have a look at the details. First things first, let's unload and show clear. To do that, you use this single lever, this is not ambidextrous, to rotate up, push up on the back of the barrel, and as you push the gun, the extractor star is forced out, ejects the empty cartridges, and you're ready to load. And of course, to load, these are dummy cartridges. You can see no primer, no powder. Simply plunk 5 bullets in, and you're good to go. And of course, you really want to tilt the revolver when you eject them, because otherwise, when the extractor star is up, sometimes they can slip underneath, and then it pops down on the rim of the cartridge, and you have a paperweight until you figure out how to get the cartridge out from under the ejector star. So, these guns are double action only. No exposed hammer, you can't thumb cock them. And it incorporates the Glock safe trigger mechanism. Yes, long before Gaston Glock used this, it was a feature that was in common use. And although this was eliminated on later models of this gun, as was the single side lever. Now, the single side lever engages underneath this part round section, and it is actually more robust than the system they replaced it with, but I imagine it was more expensive to manufacture, which is why they would do that. The sights, as you can see, are genuinely awful. Have this itty-bitty tiny rear sight and this half-moon front sight, which is very narrow. And the saving grace of this is that the sights are so close together that both sights are in the same focal plane, so you can have both sights in focus at the same time as you aim as the target, and it allows for surprisingly good accuracy. Now, this is not a factory 2-inch gun. As you can see, the writing runs right up under the sight, and this would not be normal for a factory gun. The factory gun would have this information stamped elsewhere, as far as I know. But you can see the crown is very professionally finished. So this was not a home hack job. This may in fact have been shortened at the factory, after sale as an aftermarket thing, or it might have just been done by a good gunsmith, because they exist. So the trigger pull is not very long, a little on the heavy side, but It's quite amazingly smooth. And I think, if I recall, this is between 8 and 10 pounds. So it's really quite easy to keep it on target. And that's important when you're shooting something as anemic as the 32 Smith & Wesson, which is sometimes now called 32 Smith & Wesson Short. The load I was test firing with is 1.2 grains of red dot under a 96 grain bullet, and makes an average of about 561 feet per second and 75 foot-pounds of energy. And from a 2-inch barrel, that seems to be in the right ballpark. So, this grip, very, very small, and almost identical to Smith & Wesson grips of the same size guns in the same period, and yet somehow this grip works for me and the Smith & Wesson ones don't. Go figure. So, to dismantle the gun, if you need to, it's pretty simple to remove the cylinder. I mean, basically you pop it out, let the extractor car return, and then you pull up on the cylinder while rotating it, and it comes right out. Makes it quite handy for cleaning. Later guns would have a little notch in here in the lock system that blocked the back of the cylinder so it couldn't rotate and come out on its own. But typically, it's not an issue. It stays in place nicely. So, very compact, quite well made, and it's really not quite as nicely made as a Smith & Wesson of comparable style and period, but these were considerably less expensive than Smith & Wesson, and they are good, solid revolvers, as witness this one is still up and running 125 years after it was made. There are a lot of very famous guns from the late 19th and early 20th century. The Colt Peacemaker, the Smith & Wesson Schofield, Webley Bulldog revolvers and service revolvers, Colt Pocket Hammerless 1911s, all very famous and justifiably so. But in point of fact, guns like the humble Iver Johnson were enormously more common. And while the professionals were carrying the Peacemakers and the Schofields and the M&Ps and what have you, the average person couldn't justify spending that much money, and they bought one of these for a fraction of the cost. And by one of these, I don't mean specifically the Iver Johnson, I mean inexpensive small caliber revolvers, which were made by a host of companies in their hundreds of thousands or possibly even millions. And, when great grandpa dropped a 32 in his overalls pocket to run to the feed store, it was something very like this, odds are. And, the average person didn't have a need to spring for a Colt or a Smith & Wesson unless they were reasonably well off. And guns like this remained popular up until World War II, after which they were replaced by a host of better options. Some pretty reliable semi-automatics and small calibers that were comparably sized, better quality snub-nose revolvers from Colt and Smith & Wesson, and just a lot of better options eventually came along. But regular people bought these for self-defense, and in a time where the levels of crime in American urban centers were unimaginable by today's standards, they gave good service. Less because they were effective than because people don't like being shot. But, they did the job, and they did it for the average Joe. And that deserves a place in history and some recognition and respect. Now, this is not to say that Iver Johnson was never in the news. In 1901, President William McKinley was shot with one, which was the hammer version of this gun in 32 Smith & Wesson, and died several days later. 1933, I think it was. There was an attempt on the life of President-elect Franklin Delano Roosevelt, during which the mayor of Chicago was killed with one of these. Okay, it's not good history, but it's history. Anyway, if you like the video, please hit like and subscribe. If you want to be notified when the next ones come out, hit the notifications button. If you really want to support me and support what I'm doing here, please consider clicking the link in the description below and supporting me on Patreon. I hope this finds you well. Stay safe, take care, and we'll talk to you again real soon.